So, what really makes a country's politics tick? It's not just about the laws on the books or who's in charge. There's this invisible force, this underlying current called political culture. And to really get a handle on it, we're going to dive into one of the most complex, most fascinating examples on the entire planet, India.
I mean, just think about it for a second. We're talking about a nation with over 1 billion people, hundreds of languages, and traditions stretching back for thousands of years. How on earth do we even start to understand the political life of a place like that? It honestly seems like an impossible puzzle. But it turns out there's a concept that gives us the key.
And that key is political culture. The best way to think about it is like a country's political operating system. It's not the physical hardware, the government buildings and written laws. No, it's the software. It's the shared beliefs, the gut feelings, and the unwritten rules of the game that guide how everyone acts. It's the code that makes the whole thing run. So, to really put this idea to the test, we're going to look at India's political culture through three totally different lenses. Each one comes from a major scholar who really dedicated their life to cracking this exact code. All right, our first lens comes from a scholar named W.H. Morris Jones. And his big idea was that to understand Indian politics, you have to accept that people aren't all speaking the same political language. In fact, he said they're speaking three distinct idioms all at the same time. So here's how he broke it down. First, you've got the modern idiom. This is the official language of politics you'd recognize anywhere. Parliaments, courts, constitutions, that whole deal. But running right alongside it is the traditional idiom, which is all about ancient loyalties, things like caste and village ties. And as if that's not complicated enough, he identified a third, saintly idiom, which is driven by moral authority and personal sacrifice. Think of someone like Mahatma Gandhi. The amazing thing is all three of these are happening at once, often pulling in completely different directions.
Okay, so that's one way to slice it. But what if there's a simpler way to look at this whole thing? Well, another scholar, Myron Weiner, certainly thought so. He came up with a different model that basically splits the entire Indian political world into two.
Weiner saw this two competing cultures. Up at the top, you have the elite culture. This is the world of the highly educated, urban leaders, the folks running the country's big institutions. But down below, operating in a totally different universe, is the mass culture. This is the political world of everyday people, and they're often motivated by a completely different set of rules and loyalties. And for our third and final lens, we turn to Richard L. Park. He looked at what he saw as the central conflict that really drives Indian politics, this epic tug-of-war between the old and the new. So, Park's big insight was that the real story of Indian politics is this constant clash, this tension between these deeply entrenched social traditions and the unstoppable forces of modern change. He said you can't see India as having one single culture, but as a mosaic of subcultures, all bumping into each other, all shifting and evolving. It's a perfect reminder that political culture is never static. It's alive. Okay, so the example of India really shows how powerful this concept is, right? So let's zoom out from that specific case for a minute and look at the mechanics. How does political culture actually work as a tool for understanding any country? I want you to think of political culture as a bridge. Seriously. On one side of the bridge, you've got the micro stuff, the personal beliefs, the psychology, the actions of every single individual. And way over on the other side, you have the macro stuff, the big picture, the stability of the whole nation, the direction it's heading. Political culture is the bridge that connects the two. It explains how millions of tiny individual choices can add up to create a huge national outcome. Which, of course, leads to another really fundamental question. If culture shapes our political behavior, what is it within that culture that actually gets people off the couch and involved in the first place? Well, according to the sociologist Talcott Parsons, it usually boils down to one of three things. First, there's just plain old self-interest. You want a tax cut, or you want the city to fix the potholes on your street. Second, there's a sense of civic duty, the feeling that participating is just the right thing to do as a citizen. And third, it's about deep values, your core moral or ideological beliefs that make you want to get out there and change the world. Okay, I can practically hear you thinking it. This all sounds great in theory, but isn't culture just a bit vague, a bit abstract? I mean, how can you actually measure it and compare different countries scientifically? And that is a totally fair question. It's exactly the problem that scholars like Peter Merkel set out to solve. He argued that if we're going to treat this like a science, we have to move beyond just talking about vague feelings. We need to find hard, tangible, measurable data that actually reflects a country's underlying culture.
And this is the crucial part. We can turn something as abstract as culture into cold, hard numbers. We can measure what percentage of people vote. We can survey people's trust in their government. We can quantify their attitudes about free speech. And once we have that data, we can start to scientifically compare the political culture of India with, say, Japan or Germany or anywhere else on the map.
So let's bring it all home. Why has this idea become so incredibly important for understanding politics all over the world? Well, the story of how it developed kind of tells you everything you need to know. You see, this whole field of study really exploded after World War II. It started with a few key studies in the 50s, but by the 1960s, it was a huge deal. That's when these foundational books started coming out, directly linking a country's unique culture to its chances of economic and political success. And the methods for studying it just got more and more scientific over time. And that right there brings us to the most important takeaway. At the end of the day, you simply cannot understand why some democracies succeed and others fail, or why some nations embrace change while others fight it tooth and nail, without understanding their political culture. It is the essential context for everything. I absolutely love this quote because it just nails the idea perfectly. If a country's constitution and its government buildings are like the lamps and TVs in a house, then political culture is the hidden wiring inside the walls. It's what makes everything either work together smoothly or short-circuit completely. And that just leaves us with one final question to chew on. Thinking about all this stuff, the shared attitudes, the unspoken rules, the gut feelings, what is the political culture that you live in? What's the hidden wiring in your own society?